After an 18-hour hospital shift, I came home and my key didn't fit. My stepmother said, "Pay us $26K and we'll let you in. Your sister needs a vacation." I just nodded and said, "Understood." Then I walked away. The next morning, she found a letter at the door and started screaming so loud the neighbors came outside. My name's Quinn Adler. I'm 31 years old. The shift started with a 3-car pileup on the interstate and ended with a code blue in Bay 6. 18 hours of it, a seamless blur of adrenaline, beeping machines, and the sharp, clean smell of antiseptic that clings to your scrubs, your hair, your very pores, a scent that never really washes out. It's the perfume of my profession. My ribs ached with a deep, phantom pain from performing chest compressions, a ghost that reminded me of the man who didn't make it, whose last sight on earth was my face, strained and sweating above him. All I wanted was my bed, not a hospital cot, not a couch. My bed in the quiet of my room with the familiar weight of my comforter. The world could wait, the grief could wait, all of it could wait until I'd had at least 6 hours of sleep. Driving home was an act of pure autopilot. My brain was a low, staticky hum of patient charts, medication dosages, and the lingering jitters of too much bad coffee. The streetlights smeared across the windshield like watercolors. I pictured the house, the one I grew up in, as a finish line in a marathon I hadn't known I was running. It was the one place in the universe where I didn't have to be Dr. Adler, the person in charge of life and death. I just got to be Quinn. The key to the front door, clutched in my hand, felt like the key to my own sanity. The key wouldn't turn. It slid into the lock just as it had 1,000 times before, but stopped with a hard, metallic finality. There was no give, no familiar tumble of pins, just a dead stop. I tried it again, jiggling it, thinking maybe the humidity had made the wood swell or the lock had just gotten stuck. It hadn't. It felt blocked from the inside. A wave of confusion, thick and syrupy, washed over my exhaustion. The porch light flickered on, casting a sickly yellow glow, and the face of Denise Adler, my stepmother, appeared in the window. A smug little smile played on her lips, an expression I knew all too well. It was the smile she wore when she thought she'd won something. She opened the door just a crack, the brass security chain still drawn taut. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice laced with a condescending sweetness, as if I were a lost delivery driver or someone selling something she didn't want. Through the gap, I could see Brianna Cole, my stepsister, sprawled on the couch, her eyes glued to some reality show on the television. Next to her, lounging as if he owned the place, was her unemployed boyfriend, Dylan Hayes, and he was wearing my favorite gray hoodie, the one with the faded university logo. The air that drifted through the crack in the door was thick and foreign, a mix of cheap pepperoni pizza and Brianna's cloying, fruity perfume. It hit me then, a cold, hard certainty that settled in my bones. This wasn't my home anymore. It was their territory. "I changed the locks," Denise said, her voice dripping with that fake, syrupy concern she perfected years ago. She didn't offer a reason, not at first. She just let the statement hang in the cold night air. "You know," she continued, adjusting the chain, "Brianna needs a vacation. She's been under so much stress lately." The sheer absurdity of it almost made me laugh. Brianna's stress involved choosing which filter to use on her latest social media post. My stress involved telling a family their husband and father was gone. Denise slid a folded piece of paper through the mail slot and it fluttered to the welcome mat at my feet. It was a crude, handwritten invoice on a page torn from a spiral notebook. At the top, in Denise's looping cursive, it said, "Back rent owed." The number below it was $26,000. It was a figure plucked from thin air, a number so ridiculous it was clearly not about money. It was about power. It was a ransom note for a home I didn't realize had been taken hostage. I looked from the piece of paper on the mat up to her smiling, expectant face, and I felt nothing but a profound, chilling exhaustion. The fight she wanted, the screaming match on the porch she was hoping for, wasn't in me. I was too tired to even feel rage, so I didn't argue, I didn't raise my voice. I just gave her a slow, deliberate nod. I turned without a word and walked back to my car, leaving her small, pathetic victory to echo on an empty porch. The game had started, but I wasn't going to play by her rules. I spent the night on the couch of my friend from residency, Talia Brooks. Her apartment was small but clean, and she didn't smother me with questions. Talia just made a pot of chamomile tea, handed me a mug, and let me exist in the quiet space she'd created. She knew the language of exhaustion. The flimsy throw blanket was a poor substitute for my own bed, but it was a kindness I desperately needed. The next morning, I woke up with a crick in my neck and a new, cold clarity. My first instinct was to call my dad, Daniel, who was on an extended work trip overseas, but I stopped myself. I didn't want to worry him, not yet. I didn't want to sound the alarm until I knew what kind of battle I was facing. Instead, I called Martin Hale, a housing attorney a colleague had recommended last year when one of the other doctors was having a tenant issue. I explained the situation to him on the phone, my voice clipped and factual, the same tone I'd used to deliver a patient report. Lock changed, handwritten invoice for $26,000, denial of entry. He listened patiently, the silence on his end of the line a professional courtesy. When I was done, he asked only one question, his voice calm and even. "Is your name on the deed to the house?" I told him about the trust my dad had set up years ago after my mom passed away. How the house had been placed in it, with the ownership transferring directly and solely to me on my 21st birthday. I'd never mentioned it, I never wanted to lord it over them. It was a fact I kept quiet for the sake of peace. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear the gears turning in his legal mind. "Well," Martin said, a hint of dry amusement in his tone, "that simplifies things considerably." Martin's office was a world away from the chaos of the emergency room. It was minimalist and calm, all glass and brushed steel with a faint scent of lemon polish in the air. He explained the legal process in simple terms, stripping away the jargon and getting straight to the point. There was no such thing as back rent. Legally, I was the homeowner. Denise, Brianna, and Dylan were, in the eyes of the law, tenants without a lease, occupying the space on goodwill alone, goodwill they had just incinerated. He drew up a formal eviction notice, 30 days. It was clean, official, and left no room for negotiation or argument. To go with it, he had a freshly certified copy of the property deed, my name printed in clear, undeniable black ink. It felt heavier than a piece of paper should. Martin looked at me over the top of his reading glasses. "From this moment on, you document everything," he instructed. "Every text message, every phone call, every social media post. Save it all, we're going to create a fortress of facts." I put both documents, the eviction notice and the deed, into a crisp manila envelope. Walking back to the house felt different this time. The exhaustion was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but now it was sharpened by purpose. I wasn't a daughter coming home. I was a property owner delivering a verdict. I didn't knock. I didn't ring the bell. I simply walked up the porch steps, slid the envelope onto the center of the doormat, and turned away. I waited in my car, parked a little way down the street where I had a clear view of the front door. The minutes ticked by. I watched a squirrel chase another up an oak tree. I watched a mail truck make its slow, methodical way down the block. Then, the front door opened. Denise stepped out to grab a package that had been delivered, and she spotted the envelope. She picked it up, a look of curiosity on her face, and tore it open with an air of entitlement, as if it were a check she'd been expecting. I watched as her eyes scanned the first page. Her expression shifted from smug satisfaction to confusion, then her brows furrowed in disbelief. Finally, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The scream wasn't just loud, it was theatrical. It was a high, piercing wail designed to draw an audience, a performance for the whole neighborhood. And it worked. Doors creaked open. Mrs. Gable, our elderly neighbor from next door, peered out from behind her floral curtains. A man 2 houses down who was watering his lawn paused and stared. Brianna and Dylan stumbled out onto the porch, drawn by the commotion, their faces a mixture of alarm and confusion. Denise didn't try to explain. She just pointed, her finger trembling with manufactured fury, directly at my car. "She's throwing us out," she shrieked, her voice cracking for dramatic effect. Her own family out on the street. I didn't react. I just put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, her shrinking figure and the neighborhood stage disappearing in my rearview mirror. The first move had been made. It was her serve, and she just hit it straight into the net. The first Facebook post from Denise appeared that same night. It was a masterclass in passive aggression, vague enough to be deniable but pointed enough for everyone in our small orbit to know exactly who she was talking about. It read, "It's a sad day when a child you raised as your own decides family means nothing. Some people are just cold on the inside no matter how much you love them." She didn't use my name, but she didn't have to. The comments started flooding in almost immediately from her circle of friends, a chorus of sympathy and outrage on her behalf. "You've done so much for her," one wrote. "How could she be so ungrateful?" asked another. "I'm so sorry you're dealing with this, Denise," a third chimed in. I sat on Talia's couch, the glow of my laptop screen illuminating my face, and took a screenshot. I saved the URL. I created a new folder on my desktop and titled it simply "Eviction Evidence." I didn't comment. I didn't send a single angry message to defend myself. I just documented it clinically and quietly. Talia read the post over my shoulder, her brow furrowed in anger. "You're really not going to say anything?" she asked, her voice tight. I shook my head, my eyes still on the screen. "Martin said not to. He said my silence is a better weapon than their noise right now." Her friends' comments were weaving a narrative, painting me as a heartless, money-obsessed monster who valued a piece of property over the people she supposedly called family. The story was being written, and I wasn't even in the room. If Denise's post was the opening salvo, Brianna's video the next day was a full-scale assault. It was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. She had filmed herself on her phone, sitting in what was once my mother's favorite armchair, the one with the worn floral pattern. Her makeup was perfectly smudged, her eyes red and puffy, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. I don't know what we did wrong," she sobbed into the camera, a single tear tracing a path through her foundation. "My sister, my own sister, is making us homeless. She wants to throw us out on the street with nowhere to go." She never mentioned I was her stepsister. She never mentioned that for the last 10 years I legally owned the house they were living in. She presented herself as the blameless victim and me as the cruel, inexplicable villain. Dylan was in the background, out of focus but deliberately visible, rubbing her shoulder and looking mournfully at the camera on cue. The video got hundreds of shares within a few hours. People who didn't know me, who didn't know the first thing about our family, were leaving comments calling me evil, a sociopath, a disgrace. I screenshotted the video player showing the share count. I saved the video file itself. I documented the most hateful and threatening of the public comments. The folder grew, file by file. Each one felt like another brick in the fortress of facts Martin had told me to build. The process felt strangely clinical, detached, like I was observing a patient's escalating symptoms instead of my own life imploding online. The lie was just so much more compelling than the quiet, complicated truth. The drama didn't stay contained online for long. It started to bleed into the real world, staining the edges of my professional life. One afternoon at the hospital, a nurse I barely knew, a woman named Carol, gave me a look of deep, sorrowful pity in the hallway as I was heading to the cafeteria. "I saw what your sister posted," she said, her voice a hushed whisper. "I'm just so sorry you're going through all that family trouble." The implication was painfully clear. She saw me as the one causing the trouble. The narrative they were pushing was working. Someone, probably one of Brianna's sympathetic friends, had sent the video to a local community gossip page on Facebook. Now complete strangers were weighing in, debating the morality of my actions with almost no one on my side. My carefully separated professional and personal lives were bleeding into one another, creating an ugly, contaminated mess. I started taking my lunch breaks in my car, parked in the far corner of the hospital garage just to avoid the looks, the whispers, the suffocating cloud of judgment. The hospital had always been my sanctuary, the one place where I felt in control, and now it felt compromised. I documented the community page posts, the angry comments, the ones that tagged the hospital's official page, demanding they look into the conduct of their heartless doctor. A cold knot of dread formed in my stomach. This wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about my reputation. It was about my career. I left work late one night long after the sun had set, my head pounding from a combination of stress, fluorescent lights, and a profound lack of sleep. The parking garage was mostly empty, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous concrete space. As I approached my car, I saw a small white rectangle tucked under the driver's side windshield wiper. It wasn't a parking ticket or a flyer for a car wash. It was a single sheet of cheap printer paper folded in half. My hands felt cold as I pulled it out. The message was typed in a generic sans serif font. No signature, no emotion, just cold block letters. Some doctors have accidents. It would be a shame if you couldn't work anymore. It wasn't a fistfight on the porch. It was an anonymous, chilling threat. This was a direct escalation from public shaming to a private, targeted act of intimidation. My blood ran cold. I immediately took a picture of the note where it sat on my windshield before my fingers touched it. Then, using a pair of latex gloves from my car's first aid kit, I carefully placed the paper into a Ziploc bag I kept for personal effects. This document went into a new subfolder in my eviction evidence directory. Threats? My hands were shaking as I sat in the driver's seat and called Martin. I told him what happened, my voice low and steady despite the tremor I felt inside. His voice on the other end was grim. "File a police report, Quinn. Do it tonight. It's probably just a scare tactic, but we need a record. We need everything on paper." The line had been crossed. This was no longer just a family drama. This was something darker. Martin arranged for me to retrieve my essential personal belongings from the house. It was a formal process. I wasn't allowed to go alone. A court-appointed mediator, a stoic woman named Miss Alvarez, had to accompany me to ensure things remained civil. She met me on the sidewalk, a tall woman with a no-nonsense demeanor who looked like she'd seen it all. Denise let us in, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes tracking my every move like a hawk. Brianna and Dylan were conveniently nowhere to be seen. The house felt deeply wrong. The air was stale with the smell of old takeout and air freshener failing to mask the scent of cigarettes. My mother's beautiful landscape paintings were gone from the walls, replaced by cheap, generic prints from a department store. My goal was simple and surgical: get my medical textbooks, my framed diploma, my personal files, and get out. Denise couldn't resist making snide comments the whole time I was packing boxes in my old room. "Taking more things that don't belong to you," she muttered, leaning against the doorframe. Miss Alvarez was a silent, imposing presence, and her being there was the only thing keeping the situation from exploding. I worked quickly, my movements efficient and detached, boxing up the few remaining pieces of my life. It felt like a sterile procedure: get in, retrieve what's necessary, and get out with minimal collateral damage. I went to my mother's old jewelry box, a beautiful cherry wood case I kept on my bedside table. I just wanted one thing from it: her gold locket, the one with the tiny, faded pictures of my dad and me inside. The box was still there, but as I lifted it, it felt strangely light. My stomach dropped. I opened the lid. It was almost completely empty. A few cheap costume jewelry earrings Brianna had left behind were scattered on the velvet lining, but all of my mother's pieces, her pearls, her anniversary ring, her collection of silver brooches, were gone. My hands started to shake slightly as I rummaged through the empty compartments. There was a false bottom in the box, something I'd forgotten about long ago. I pried it up with my fingernail. Underneath, there wasn't more jewelry. There was a stack of flimsy carbon copy papers. They were pawn tickets, dozens of them with dates stretching back over the last 2 years. Each one listed an item of my mother's, her gold earrings, her sapphire necklace, even her wedding band. And there, at the very bottom of the stack, was the most recent one. A silver link bracelet with a single hummingbird charm, the one she wore every single day of her life. The ticket was dated 18 months ago. Sold for $2,750. This wasn't just theft. It was the systematic, cold-blooded erasure of my mother's memory for quick cash. I held the small, thin pawn ticket in my hand, the paper trembling slightly. The shop was listed as Ray's Gems, a place on the other side of town just 2 miles away. As I stared at the details, another piece of the betrayal slammed into me. The name on the ticket, the person who had signed for the cash, wasn't Denise, it was Brianna. My stepmother had sent her own daughter to sell my dead mother's things. This was the hard, undeniable proof I didn't even know I was looking for. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding or a desperate act. It was a calculated long-term violation, a conspiracy of greed between the two of them. It explained so much, the sudden shopping sprees, the weekend trips I knew they couldn't afford. I carefully slipped the single pawn ticket into the pocket of my jeans, making sure my expression didn't change. I couldn't let Denise see that she just handed me a weapon. Miss Alvarez, the mediator, looked at me, and for a brief moment I saw a flicker of something in her otherwise impassive eyes. Was it pity, or just professional understanding? I finished packing my last box in complete silence, the weight of that small piece of paper in my pocket feeling heavier than all the textbooks and files combined. This changed everything. My quiet, lawful revenge now had a new, much more personal objective. This wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about recovering a piece of my mother. I glanced at Denise as I walked out the door. She was smiling, that same smug smile from the first night, thinking she had successfully humiliated me. She had no idea what she had just given me. Back in the quiet refuge of Talia's apartment, I laid the pawn ticket on the coffee table. It looked small and insignificant, but it felt like a declaration of war. This was the point of no return. Any lingering doubt I might have had, any shred of familial obligation I might have felt toward them, was completely gone. It was burned to ash. They hadn't just taken my home, they had been auctioning off my past, one precious memory at a time. I took a picture of the ticket and emailed it to Martin, then called him. I told him what I'd found, my voice low and controlled. He was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. "This is technically a separate legal matter, Quinn," he said gently. "A criminal one, in fact. But for our purposes, it strengthens our position immensely. It speaks to character, and theirs is revealing." I knew I wasn't going to press charges or sue them for the value of the jewelry. That wasn't the point. It would be a messy, public fight that would only feed their narrative of family drama. The point was the bracelet. That one piece was the only one I might be able to get back. The eviction deadline, still weeks away, was no longer just a date on a legal document. It was a countdown to reclamation. I made a decision then and there. I wasn't just going to outlast them and force them out. I was going to undo the damage they had done, piece by tangible piece. My first stop tomorrow wouldn't be the hospital, it would be Ray's Gems. The pawn shop smelled of old paper, industrial cleaner, and the faint, stale ghost of cigarette smoke. It was a small, cramped space, the glass counters filled with a jumble of other people's stories, forgotten rings, outdated electronics, and musical instruments that hadn't been played in years. An older man with kind, crinkling eyes and a weary face was behind the counter. His name tag, pinned to a plaid shirt, read Ray Collins, the owner. I placed the pawn ticket on the counter between us. He picked it up, his thick fingers surprisingly gentle, and looked at it, then at me. A flash of recognition crossed his face. "I remember this one," he said, his voice a low gravel. The girl was nervous, kept looking over her shoulder. Said it was her grandmother's and she just needed some cash to help her out of a jam. He disappeared into a back room, and the silence was filled only by the hum of a dusty box fan in the corner. He returned a minute later holding a small, dark blue velvet-lined box. He set it on the counter and opened it. And there it was. The silver was tarnished and dull, but the little hummingbird charm suspended from a single link was unmistakable. My mother loved hummingbirds. She'd hung a feeder outside the kitchen window and would tell me they were tiny miracles, proof that something so small could be so strong. Seeing the bracelet felt like a punch to the gut and a breath of fresh air all at once. It was real, it was here, it was within my reach. How much to buy it back? I asked. My voice was steadier than I felt, the clinical detachment I'd learned in the ER serving me well. Ray Collins, the shop owner, pulled out a notepad and a pen and did some quiet calculations. He wrote down a number and turned the pad around for me to see. It was significantly more than the $2,750 they had gotten for it. Pawn shops, I was learning, were not in the business of sentimentality. It was a lot of money, more than I should have been spending on something that wasn't a necessity. But it wasn't about the money, it couldn't be. It was about what the bracelet represented. It was a tangible piece of my mother that they had tried and failed to erase. It was a memory they couldn't sell off for good. Without a moment of hesitation, I took out my credit card and slid it across the counter. It was an irreversible decision, a commitment. As the machine whirred and beeped, processing the transaction, I felt a fundamental shift inside me. The bone-deep exhaustion was still there, a constant companion, but now it was fueled by a white-hot sense of purpose. Before handing the bracelet to me, Ray took a soft polishing cloth and carefully worked at the tarnished silver, bringing back some of its original shine. "Glad to see it going back to its rightful home," he said, meeting my eyes. He didn't ask for the story, but he knew there was one. He just knew. I didn't put the bracelet in the box or tuck it away in my purse. I clasped it around my left wrist. The cool, solid weight of the silver against my skin was grounding, a constant physical reminder of my new goal. This fight wasn't just about enforcing a property deed anymore. That felt small now, procedural. This was about justice. Not the kind of justice you find in a courtroom with lawyers and judges, but a deeply personal justice. My new, bolder goal was to cleanse the house of their presence, their memory, their entire influence. I wouldn't just evict them, I would erase them from that space. I would fumigate their memory from every room. I would restore the home my mother had made, not just reclaim the building my dad had bought. When I got back to Talia's apartment, she saw the bracelet on my wrist immediately. Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't ask where it came from or how I got it. She just nodded slowly. "It's beautiful, Quinn." The risk was no longer just about my reputation or my career, those were tactical concerns. This was about my soul. I had to see this through to the absolute end, no matter what it cost me. The fight was no longer a defensive action I'd been forced into. It had become a crusade. Denise retaliated, and she aimed straight for the heart of my life, my career. A few days after my visit to the pawn shop, she filed a formal complaint with the hospital's patient advocacy board. It was a calculated, vicious move. In her written statement, she claimed my unstable and aggressive behavior made her deeply concerned for the safety of my patients. She twisted the story of me delivering the eviction notice, painting me as an unhinged aggressor who screamed at her on her own doorstep. She cited Brianna's tearful video as proof of my abusive tendencies and fragile mental state. It was an intricate web of calculated lies designed specifically to trigger a professional review and damage my credibility. It worked. An official-looking email with a red importance flag landed in my inbox. The subject line read, "Mandatory meeting request Ray, professional conduct." The sender was Marion Foster, the hospital's head of human resources. My heart started pounding in my chest, a frantic, panicked rhythm. They had found the one place I thought was safe, my professional sanctuary, and they had set it on fire. This was no longer about public opinion on a gossip page, this was about my medical license. This was about everything I had worked for. Marion Foster's office smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and printer toner. The room was all neutral colors and straight lines, a place designed to soothe while it judged. She had a manila folder with my name on it open on the desk. Her expression was careful, professionally blank. On the wall behind her, a framed mission statement promised dignity and compassion in 6 tidy lines. I wanted to laugh at the polished irony. Dr. Adler, she began, and the use of my professional title made the whole thing feel even more official. She slid a stack of printed screenshots across the desk toward me. Denise's post, Brianna's tearful video, a handful of the nastier comments from strangers tagging the hospital. "We need to understand what's going on," she said. "This has reached the hospital in ways we can't ignore." My hands were steady when I opened my bag. I pulled out a copy of the deed and placed it on her desk like placing an X-ray on a light box. The paper sat there, plain and unimpressive, but it had more power than anything Marion could print. She read it, her eyes flicking to the name at the top, and for the first time her practiced calm softened into something like attention. "I own the house," I said simply. "There was a trust, my name on the deed. I didn't bring this up because, frankly, I wanted to avoid fights, but that doesn't change the facts." She nodded and then reached for another sheet I handed her, a photo of the typed threat left on my windshield. I told her about the pawn ticket quietly, but I didn't show it to her. The jewelry felt like a private wound. I wasn't ready to make it public in a meeting that might get filed away and misread. Marion listened without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad with quick, efficient strokes. "There are 2 problems here," she finally said. "One is the public social media narrative, which we can address by you providing documentation and by limiting public comment. The other is the threat left on your car. That's a safety issue." She folded her hands, looking at me over the top of the folder. "We are not going to start disciplinary action today. The hospital recognizes that this began as a private property dispute, but we need it contained. For now, we will treat this as a personnel matter that requires resolution." Her meaning was clear even if her words were soft. "Nothing formal now, but keep it quiet and don't give them more material." She tapped a pen against the paper. "If this continues to impact patient care or if there's more threatening behavior, we will have to reevaluate." "I'm asking you to get this resolved," Dr. Adler quietly and quickly. "Can you do that?" I could feel my shoulders tighten at the phrasing. It wasn't a question of ability, it was a deadline disguised as an option. I thought of the long nights at the hospital, of the lives I'd strapped back together with sutures and steady hands. "I'll handle it," I said, and the words came out controlled. "I'm already documenting everything." I didn't tell her how many hours I'd spent copying URLs and saving video files. I didn't tell her how tired I was of defending the only place on earth where I thought I could breathe. When I left Marion's office, the sunlight in the hallway felt abrasive. Her conditional piece, "no formal action for now," was relief wrapped in a demand. "Quiet and quick, make it go away." It wasn't the victory I wanted, but it was a lifeline. The hospital was off the hook for the moment, but the underlying threat to my reputation remained. Talia met me in the staff kitchen, exactly where she'd always been when the world felt like it might tilt. She had made coffee and handed me a paper cup without asking, as if some part of her knew what I needed before I did. I sat at the small round table, the bracelet cold and reassuring against my wrist. "How'd it go?" she asked, the kettle tapping in the background. I told her briefly. Marion had been reasonable but firm. The hospital wanted the situation fixed and wanted it fixed quickly. Talia nodded, then leaned in, lowering her voice like she was about to tell me something private and dangerous. "Listen," she said, "this might explain a lot. Dylan has family connections. His cousin works in hospital administration. Scheduling, actually." The words landed like a cold stone. I hadn't known how the note had appeared on my car. I'd assumed someone had waited outside the hospital. The idea that someone with an inside line could know my shifts, my patterns, the nights I would be vulnerable, was a different kind of violation. It meant the enemy had a map of my life where my routines were marked in red. "How do you know that?" I asked, my voice small. Talia rubbed her thumb against the rim of her coffee cup. "One of the residents overheard Dylan bragging at a party, said something about helping out his girlfriend, making sure her stepmom could get a night off. Told someone at work, it got around, then someone else mentioned a cousin in admin who handles scheduling. It's not a secret, but it's not obvious unless you know who to listen to. My stomach tightened. Every late shift, every night I parked and walked to my car, suddenly felt exposed. It wasn't just the anonymous threat on the windshield anymore. It was the feeling that someone in blue scrubs could be watching, mentally clocking which doors I used, which lights I left on when I took a smoke break. So they could have known when I'd be at work, I asked. Exactly, Talia said. And if someone in scheduling wanted to, they could find out which nights you're on call, which weeks you're available. Dylan's family has been around Denise and Brianna, it's plausible. A nausea that had nothing to do with food rose in me. I had always separated my life, work was work, home was home. Now that line had been blurred by a petty, vicious campaign. The thought of shields breached made me feel raw and small. What should I do? I asked. Keep documenting, Talia said. Be careful with conversations in public areas at the hospital. Lock your car. Report the note to the police if you haven't already, and don't go anywhere alone if you don't have to. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand briefly, an anchor. I'll help. I'll keep an eye and cover for you when I can. Her small gestures mattered more than any plan. Having someone who saw the absurdity and the danger and chose to stand with me was a weight off my chest. But the knowledge that the enemy had eyes inside the hospital altered the battlefield. The eviction notice would still run its legal course, but now every move I made at work could be mirrored back into the narrative they were building. The conditional piece from human resources bought me time, but it also came with the requirement that I fix everything on a timetable I hadn't chosen. That timetable got cruelly shorter a few days later. I was at Talia's, the bracelet humming faintly against my wrist, when a courier knocked at the door and handed me a thick envelope. My name was on it in formal print. Inside was a set of papers and an official-looking stamp. I recognized the language before I read the details. Denise had filed for a temporary restraining order against me. She claimed I was harassing her, making threats, and that her life was in danger. In her affidavit, she described me as volatile and unstable, saying the eviction notice was part of a pattern of intimidation. She even claimed that during our supervised walkthrough I'd made aggressive gestures, an outright lie. The papers required me to appear in court on a specific date. There was a formal order telling her to stay away from her home and me to stay away from her and Brianna until the hearing. I sat down on Talia's couch hard enough to feel the springs. For a second the room tilted. The legal language was clear and cold. The burden of proof would shift to me to show the court that Denise's claims were unfounded. It was a tactic as old as petty vendettas. File a paper, make the other person spend time and money defending themselves, make them bleed out resources and patience. Martin was practical on the phone. This is a delaying move, he said. It's designed to complicate the eviction and distract you. These are common when people are desperate. We will respond. We will ask for it to be dismissed, but you'll have to appear in court. How will this affect the eviction? I asked, my voice creaking. It could slow things down temporarily, Martin said, but it won't stop the underlying ownership facts. We need to be strategic. Show up with your documentation, show the pawn ticket if necessary, and we fight it there. He added, without malice but with blunt clarity, this is going to cost you time and money, Quinn. Be prepared. I felt a cold, private fury then, the kind that sits below adrenaline and grief. They were trying to use the law I respected to punish me. They were weaponizing the system to wear me down. I thought of Mom, of the small rituals she kept in the house, her hummingbird stories, the way she would patch things with patience. I tightened my fist until the bracelet pressed into my skin. The restraining order wasn't going to silence me. If anything, it sharpened my resolve. It forced my hand into the courtroom, but it also forced their lies into a place where evidence mattered. The eviction, the pawn ticket, the deed, facts didn't care about tears on camera. Talia put a hand on my shoulder. We'll get through this, she said. The certainty in her voice steadied me in a way nothing else had. I pictured the rows of chairs in the courthouse, the judge's bench, the smell of coffee and official paper. I pictured Denise sitting there, eyes wide with righteous fury. My life had become a series of legal rooms. The hospital wanted quiet, the neighbors wanted spectacle, Denise wanted revenge. I wanted my home and the memory of the woman who'd raised me. I would go to court. I would bring my documentation, my deed, my eviction notice, and the small, stubborn proof of the pawn ticket. I would show up with Talia if she could, with Martin directing, and I would not flinch. The temporary restraining order was a desperate, noisy ploy. I had been quiet for too long. It was time to speak with the evidence already laid on the table. Brianna's new video arrived like a punch. It showed up in my feed with that little red notification icon, and for a split second I hoped it was an apology. It wasn't. She was sitting on the same floral armchair she'd used before, but this time she was holding a framed photo of Mom smiling at some summer picnic, hair loose and wind-tousled. The picture had always been a quiet thing in our house. Seeing it used as a prop made something in me go cold. My mom would be so ashamed of what Quinn is doing, Brianna said, voice breaking on cue. She wiped at a tear and angled the camera so the frame filled the screen. She loved this house. She would have wanted us to be a family. She looked straight into the lens, and the way she said it made every sympathetic person who saw it feel like they were looking at the true victim. Dylan hovered off camera, making noises of sympathy, the kind you'd practice when you're trying to get people on your side. It was the worst kind of weaponization, using my mother, the person who couldn't answer back, to make me look cruel. They'd been selling Mom's things for months, pawning bracelets and brooches as if they were just metal and gems. They'd let the garden go to weeds, but in Brianna's video she was the injured child and I was the monster. The hypocrisy stung like salt. I watched it once, feeling the room tilt. My hands were fists in my lap. I saved the file, filed it in the eviction evidence folder, took screenshots of the comments and the shares. There were a dozen variations of outrage already piling up below her post. How could she? Money before family? Disgraceful. People who didn't know the facts were already deciding I'd chosen to gut my mother's memory for profit. It was almost ingenious the way a frame and a well-timed sob could rewrite the truth. For a long time after I closed my laptop, I sat very still and let myself feel the hurt. Not the legal hurt, the kind that math and papers could measure, but the private burn. Using Mom like that felt like a violation deeper than the lockout. It made everything feel sacrilegious. When you lose someone, the small things become holy. The sound of a teapot, a favorite chair, a bracelet that jingled when she washed dishes. They'd turned those holy things into props. That night the house felt farther away than ever. The eviction notice was still a weapon in my hand, cold, effective, but this video made me realize the fight couldn't just be about property. It had to be about reputation, about the story people would tell about my mother once Brianna's lie had been the loudest one. I didn't want Mom's memory to be a tool in someone else's drama. I wanted it to be a memory that meant something true. My phone rang late that night. The number was an international one, and for a second I considered letting it go to voicemail. Then I saw the name, Dad. My hands were still warm from the kettle I hadn't had time to drink. When I answered, his voice came across thin with jet lag and worry. Quinn. Are you all right? He asked, and the tiredness in his voice was immediate and honest. I hadn't wanted to involve him from the start. He was halfway around the world, and I didn't want to throw his life into the middle of this mess. But one of his old friends had messaged him, and he had followed the chain of links and seen the posts. I started to cry before I could explain anything. The tears were sudden and ugly, the weeks of exhaustion and humiliation pooling into something ugly and loud. Dad didn't say anything for a long moment. He just let me breathe and sob without interrupting. That quiet was more comfort than he'd ever managed in person. I'm so sorry, he said finally, voice thick. I should have seen this sooner. I should have, he stopped himself. The should-haves between us had always been the hardest to swallow. I read everything Martin sent me. I saw the deed, Quinn. I saw the notice. I saw the threats. I see Denise's posts. I see the video. Hearing him say the deeds and the notices made them feel less like my secret weapons and more like truths with witnesses. He told me he'd booked the first flight home. I can't fix what happened, he said, but I'm coming. This ends now. There was a steadiness in his voice that felt like an anchor. He asked about the police report for the note on my car and about the pawn ticket. I told him what I'd found at Ray's Gems and about the bracelet on my wrist. When he said he was filing for divorce that morning, I almost dropped the phone. There was a small envelope of silence in his words, the kind that carries a decision after a long, terrible hesitation. I waited too long, he admitted, and for that I'm sorry, but I'm done pretending. I'm coming home to help you make it right. Whatever you need, say the word. It wasn't a grand entrance. He didn't announce himself as a knight. There was no theatrical promise of sweeping justice, but there was a clear line drawn in his voice. He would be there, and he would not tolerate the lies being told about his daughter or his wife's memory. For the first time since this had started, I felt like I had an ally who could stand in the middle of the neighborhood and speak something true out loud. We talked for a long time. He wanted the specifics, wanted to know the names, the posts, the dates. He told me he hadn't realized how far Denise had gone. He confessed recent doubts about the marriage and said he'd met someone kind, someone who made him want to be honest and move forward. There was no drama in the admission, only relief. He promised he'd stand by the facts when he got home. He promised to be there on eviction day. When we hung up, the house felt smaller and the night a little less sharp. Dad's call didn't erase the humiliations, the threats, the panic. It didn't clean out the pawn tickets or return the weeks of whispers. But it made a space where I could breathe for a minute. It meant I wouldn't have to face the next steps alone. Those next days were a quiet frenzy. The temporary restraining order hearing was a blur of fluorescent lights and official voices. Martin had told me it was a common tactic when the other side needed delay. The judge dismissed it, as Martin had predicted, but that small, public theater of me standing in front of a judge listening to Denise's lawyer describe me as a threat was humiliating in a way that reached into my bones. At the hospital, the whispers didn't stop. Marion's check-ins continued, small meetings that felt more like reminders, handle this, quiet and fast. Colleagues avoided eye contact in the cafeteria. An old friend called and said, "Everyone keeps telling me to be the bigger person." They didn't know the pawn tickets had existed or that Mom's bracelet was now back on my wrist. They only knew the most dramatic, most shareable version of the story. More than anything, I felt watched. Every movement had its own low-grade paranoia. Did someone see me buy the bracelet? Was someone taking notes when I went to Ray's Gems? The hospital had gone from sanctuary to stage. Marion's stance that the hospital would not act formally if I fixed this quickly felt less like help and more like a looming condition. It was as if they were washing their hands of the mess, asking me to clean it before the stain reached them. The judge's dismissal felt like a hollow win. Legally, we had the high ground, but socially, I was losing. Denise's video using Mom's photo had done a kind of damage that paperwork couldn't immediately undo. Invitations I used to get to weekend barbecues stopped coming. People who'd once trusted me seemed suddenly unsure. I kept telling myself that time and evidence would turn this back to my favor, that the deed and the pawn ticket were hard facts that couldn't be erased by a sob on camera. But the slow ache of isolation lingered. One morning, a text from Denise arrived, cruel in its smallness. A photo of Mom's garden, now a tangle of dead roses and choking weeds, and 3 words typed beneath it. "Everything beautiful dies." I looked at that picture until my eyes blurred. The garden had been Mom's sanctuary. After residency, I hadn't been able to keep up with it, and I'd trusted Denise to tend it. The image felt like a spit in my face, a deliberate strike at the part of me that still felt like a child, needing to care for the things Mom had loved. That text undid me for a while. I sat in my car outside Talia's apartment with the bracelet cold against my wrist, the metal hummingbird catching the light. The fact that someone could be so petty, so intent on breaking small things that meant everything made me ache. When my dad later texted, "Landed, on my way, don't face them alone," his words were a lifeline. The promise of his presence was the thin thread holding me together. I thought of Mom, her hands in the soil, the way she smiled at hummingbirds, the small rituals she kept that made the house into a home. The weeds in that picture felt like evidence of neglect and betrayal. For a moment, I felt like I'd failed her, like the house had become a place where memory could be stolen and sold. But the bracelet on my wrist reminded me that not everything was gone. There were pieces left to reclaim, and if Dad was coming home, I didn't have to reclaim them alone. I was sitting in my car outside Talia's apartment, watching the bracelet catch the streetlight when my phone buzzed. The message from Dad was short and plain: "Landed, on my way, don't face them alone, wait for me." I read it 3 times like a prayer. The bracelet felt cold and steady against my skin, a small, private victory I could hold on to. It was the only tangible win I'd had since Denise changed the locks. There was a thin line between confidence and wishful thinking. I told myself not to build my whole fight around Dad's arrival. I had legal papers, a lawyer who actually believed in the strength of facts, and the deed that should have ended this before it even began. But hope has a way of making the air lighter. The thought of someone who still understood the truths of our history standing on the porch with me steadied my hands. Eviction day came with the kind of glare that seemed determined to watch every small drama. I ordered a moving truck the night before, and Martin arranged for 2 sheriff's deputies to be there. He'd been precise and quiet in the way lawyers are when they know the law matters more than emotion. I had also asked Talia to come because I couldn't imagine doing it without her. She texted me at dawn, "Coffee and steady hands, see you." Her steady presence had become one of the few things I trusted without question. I stood on the sidewalk, the gravel crunching under my shoes, holding a single new key between my fingers. The moving truck idled at the curb, its engine humming like a patient animal. Deputies in dark uniforms spoke quietly to the movers, checking lists. A small crowd of neighbors had lined the porches like it was a Saturday morning parade. Mrs. Gable was there, arms folded, watching with a surprised frown. A boy from down the block leaned on the fence, his phone out, probably live streaming. The whole street had become a stage. Denise and Brianna were stalling in that way people do when they think time is an ally. Boxes were being taken to the porch and then put down again. Brianna had mascara streaks on her cheeks, but no camera this time. Maybe she thought crying face to face would seem more convincing. Dylan hovered, looking like he might faint at any moment, hoodie hanging loose over his shoulders like it belonged to someone important. Denise argued with the deputies, voice high and strained. "There's got to be a mistake. She can't just, this is my home too." Her words were practiced. She tried to make the deputies' files look like acts of cruelty. She wanted them to pity her. I didn't speak. I watched the clock on my phone. My silence had become a strategy. If I answered every rant, I'd be pulled into the cheap theater she wanted. At 11:45, a car pulled up and my chest did something tight and hopeful. Dad stepped out, jet-lagged and tired, but he moved with a set of calm that made the air around him serious. He didn't look at Denise. He didn't look at Brianna. He walked straight toward me. He handed me a sealed envelope without preamble. "This is for you," he said, his voice low. When I opened it, inside was a copy of the divorce petition he'd filed that morning. It was small and ordinary, and it felt like a clean cut. He introduced me to a woman waiting by the car. "Quinn, this is Grace," he said. Grace smiled with that quiet, real kindness that doesn't need drama. She didn't stand between us and the rest of the world. She simply stood back, an ally in the wings. Dad didn't yell or make grand declarations. He didn't have to. His first words landed like a fact. "Denise." "It's over." The neighbors' murmurs hushed. When he spoke to the small crowd, his voice carried without trying. "For anyone confused, my daughter Quinn owns this house. She has for 10 years. I've seen the threats and the lies. I'm ashamed of how they treated her." He looked at Brianna, then at Denise. And you, Brianna, selling your mother's jewelry, this is wrong, we have the receipts. The pause was long enough for the truth to settle in. Brianna's face went white. Denise's mouth started to form words, then closed. For once I saw indecision cross her face and the smug armor she'd worn for weeks cracked. Denise tried one last thing. She reached for a sob that sounded close to real and appealed to Dad. Daniel, you can't let her ruin us, but he'd already handed her the envelope of papers. I'm not letting her do anything, Dad said. I'm watching her finish what you started. This house belongs to Quinn. His voice was quiet and final. At noon, the head deputy checked the paperwork one last time and nodded. The property is yours, ma'am, he said. The words were simple but official, and they had a weight to them that made Denise's protests look small. As the movers began loading the last of their boxes, I felt a pull inside me that was both exhaustion and relief. This was what I'd been pacing the weeks to reach, the legal moment where facts finally met the performance. I walked up the porch steps I had been denied weeks earlier. The boards creaked under my boots like they remembered the rhythm of my footfall. I slipped the new key into the lock. It slid in smoothly, a perfect fit like something that had been waiting. For a heartbeat, I closed my eyes and let that small, daily pleasure fill me, the key in the lock, the lever turning. The deadbolt clicked into place with a sound that felt like a sentence being pronounced. When I opened the door, the house smelled like stale air and cheap incense. Their presence had left a scent in the rooms like an afterimage. The living room, which had been a place of noise and lounging, was now boxes and blankets. The paintings Mom loved were still missing, replaced by blank patches on the wall where cheap prints had hung. But the light through the windows fell in the same way it always had. The kitchen still had the dent on the counter where Dad had once dropped a pan. The bones of the house were mine again. Movers brought the last bags and carried them to the truck. Denise's protests dwindled into thin, personal threats that were mostly just noise. Brianna hugged a pillow so tight it looked painful and refused to meet my eyes. Dylan slunk behind boxes, clutching what must have been my old hoodie. The deputies were polite but firm. They did their job with the matter-of-fact decency of people who see scenes like this often. Martin hovered at a respectful distance, arms folded, ready if anything needed a quick legal correction. I did things in small, deliberate motions. I changed the locks to the ones Martin recommended, the kind that make you feel safer just knowing they're there. I called the utility company from my phone and transferred the accounts into my name. Martin had warned me that leaving things in someone else's name could invite complications. The clerk on the other end was bored but efficient, and the small bureaucratic clicks felt like reinforcements being snapped into place. Neighbors came closer, some with nods that felt like apologies, some with the blank curiosity of people watching a spectacle. Mrs. Gable drifted up the walkway and handed me a plate of muffins. "For the boxes," she said, and her voice trembled. It was the sort of small kindness that made the world feel stitched back together, one modest act at a time. I didn't give a speech. I didn't gloat. I didn't slap back with the stories they told about me. All I did was stand in the doorway, the bracelet on my wrist catching the light, and watch the last of the moving boxes roll down the ramp. The house could never be exactly what it had been, too much had been said and done, but some things were repairable. The foundation held, the memories hadn't been erased, they'd just been bruised. At one point, Dad came over and put his hand on my shoulder, a quick, strong pressure that wasn't showy but meant everything. "You did good," he said. "You did exactly right." I looked at him and then at Grace, who gave me a small, steady smile. Having Dad there made the legal facts feel human again. It turned paper and signatures into a living, breathing thing, a home finally standing on the right name. When the truck left and the last pair of shoes was taken, the street exhaled. The deputies packed up and nodded, paperwork filed, their presence like a punctuation mark. There was an odd, hollow quiet that settled over the house, a clean kind of silence that felt possible only after a storm has passed. I walked through each room slowly, the sound of my footsteps loud in the empty spaces. I ran a hand on the banister where Mom used to lean and tell me stories about hummingbirds. My fingers found a small nick in the wood where a chisel must have nicked it years ago. Those little marks mattered. They told me the house remembered us. Outside, the garden was a tangle, the rose bushes turned inward and hopeless. The sight hit me in a place that felt like Mom's hand itself, but when I looked closer, I could see new green pushing through the old roots. It was a reminder that not everything beautiful dies, some things wait beneath the mess to come back. I took the bracelet off for a moment and held it in my palm. The hummingbird charm glinted. Then I slipped it back on and felt the tiny seals of comfort it offered: Mom's laugh, the smell of her coffee, the way she would hum when she worked in the garden. Those were my real trophies. The eviction had restored more than the house, it restored the right to remember on my terms. That night, after boxes were stacked in neat piles and the house had been secured, Dad, Grace, Talia, and I sat at the kitchen table with mugs of coffee gone cold. We made plans in quiet voices: who would help clean the garden, what repairs to prioritize, which paintings needed to come down from storage to be rehung. It felt ordinary and miraculous at once. The ordinary was the healing. Making lists, scheduling a cleaner, deciding where Mom's chair should go. I slept in my own bed that night. When I turned the key in the lock and walked through the hallway, the antiseptic smell of the hospital couldn't touch the house. Here, the smell was of old wood and fresh paper and a hint of the tea Talia had brewed. The house felt like a lung that could take a deep breath again. In the days that followed, there were more small battles: court dates, phone calls from Denise's lawyer, a few nasty posts that tried to keep the story alive. But the hard facts were now in place, and people began to notice the difference between a shouted accusation and quiet proof. The deed sat in Martin's office with an attached file of everything we'd documented. Posts, videos, the pawn ticket, the note on my car. It was a fortress of facts, just like Martin had told me to build. Every time I reached for the bracelet, it reminded me why I had started this. Not for spectacle, not for revenge in the sensational sense, but so that Mom's things, Mom's garden, our name, and our history could belong to the person they were meant to belong to. The key in the lock was a small, private victory. The larger one was quieter: the knowledge that peace, when defended with truth and patience, can return. 6 months later, the house has a quiet I didn't know I could trust. It's not the hollow silence of an empty place. It's the soft, steady kind of quiet that lets you think. The first thing I did was hire people to clean every inch, the kind of deep clean that reaches into corners you forget exist. They scrubbed away the greasy fingerprints and the smell of packets of takeout, and they threw out things that had nothing to do with us. It felt like washing away an argument. I painted the walls a warm, neutral color, nothing dramatic, just a calm I could come home to. I rehung Mom's paintings in places I remembered her choosing, and I moved her armchair to the window where the light falls in at just the right angle. Replacing those small arrangements felt like setting down heavy luggage and breathing. The fridge is finally mine: yogurt, fruit, the expensive coffee I love. It sounds silly, but finding my own almond milk in the door felt like permission to stay. Word travels in neighborhoods, and I heard through small, careful channels that Denise lost her claim for spousal support. Brianna and Dylan bounced between couches for a while, then moved out of town. The social noise faded. People stopped tagging the hospital and stopped debating a story that never had all the facts. The worst of the gossip dwindled into nothing, as rumors often do when there's no fuel to keep them burning. Dad calls every Sunday now. He and Grace are building something calm and steady. She has a gentle way about her that made a huge difference in how he came back to us. We don't talk about Denise much. When her name comes up, it's brief and practical, the facts, then a fold back into the comfortable present. The cost of all this is visible. A few new gray hairs at my temples, a bank statement that made me close my eyes, and a lingering mistrust of how quickly a story can go wrong. But I can balance that against the house when it's quiet and warm and mine. I still document things. You'll catch me saving an email or taking a picture of a receipt. It's habit now, a way to keep the peace from getting messy again. But mostly, I try to let the ordinary small things add up into a life. Making tea in the morning, leaving a note for Dad about which plant needs water, fixing the bathroom door that always stuck. Those daily acts have become my small, steady victories. On my back porch with a mug in my hands, the garden is breathing again. I hired a local landscaper, an older woman named Rosa who arrives with dirt under her nails and a smile that doesn't ask permission. We spent weekends pulling weeds and planting new life. The hummingbird feeder hangs where Mom used to watch the tiny birds dart in and out. It hums with visitors now, bright wings and urgent calls like tiny miracles. The bracelet is on my wrist, the silver hummingbird catching the sun. I catch myself touching it when I'm thinking, as if I'm checking a pulse. It feels less like a victory lap and more like a relic of reclamation. When nights are long at the hospital now, I go home. I turn the key in the lock and it works every time. The sound of the deadbolt sliding home is small and ordinary, but it holds a weight I couldn't explain to anyone who hasn't been turned out of their life. I came home after a 12-hour shift last week, exhausted in that particular way only the emergency room gives you, and the house greeted me like a promise kept. The kettle was on the stove. Talia had left a note about fresh coffee and where she'd put the spare blanket. The piece isn't theatrical or loud, it's a quiet that lets you sleep. It was the revenge I didn't expect to want. Not spectacle, not angry vindication, but a place to rest. If you stuck with me through this, thank you. Sometimes the softest victories are the ones that matter most. If you've ever had to fight to get back something that was yours, share your story in the comments. Please subscribe and keep listening. There are more quiet stories to tell.